With the hand now slick with John's vomit, the gravity of the situation is sinking in. I'm 15 to 20 kilometres offshore, conditions are worsening, it's just turned dark, the last boat I'd seen was a few hours ago, I'm at the helm of a sailboat that I'm totally clueless how to do anything on but hold the tiller, and the guy that knows how to sail is now an incapacitated 82-year-old with a pre-existing heart condition. Holy fart factory, friends, so welcome back to the next instalment of the Sailboat Saga. Last episode we delved into my survey day suckage. This episode we're going to talk over one of the most, I would say, harrowing, overwhelming experiences I've ever had in my life, the ill-fated yacht delivery. As seen through the eyes of the average Joe, just dipping my toes into the world of coastal and Bluewater cruising. So picking up from my last episode, at this point in the story, the boat is in my name, but it's still sitting on John's mooring in Sydney. Basically, in the interim, I've just popped up once to give John the rest of the cash and to prep the boat for the trip down. I replaced all the filters and the belts and the engine oil and generally just gave it a good once over just to make sure it was good to go for the 300 kilometre trip down the coast. Okay, so I get the green light from the marina berth down in Bermagui to say that our lucky number 13 is secured and ready to go. So I blocked the whole week out with work, even though it should probably only take a few days to get to the new berth. John and I arranged to meet at the boat. The plan is to load up, cast off and then sail over to Manly and just familiarise myself with the boat and just get comfortable enough to take over should anything happen to John. Then we're going to anchor overnight, get used to the motion of the ocean as they say, and hopefully that'll alleviate any seasickness that might occur. And then the plan was to get off super early and then take shifts of 4 hours on, 4 hours off. So a pretty good plan, I thought. So it gets to the day, Friday afternoon, we head up to Sydney. The wind on the forecast is pretty angry looking, so it wasn't really surprising that when we met John, it was super windy down near where the boat was. We decided to knock it on the head and then wait for a better weather window later in the week. So that's a good segue into introducing John. So John's 82 at this point. He's very active. He's more like a 60-year-old. It's probably the sailing, who's to say, but he's still good to go. So he's owned this boat for 38 years and most of his time he's been doing solo. But because John's so old and having owned the boat for 38 years, his passage of time is slightly skewed, I would say. So when he says things like, I've got a brand new set of fairlies with a harness, I'm like, sweet, sorted. Only to look at the manufacturer date to see it's from the mid-90s. So this trip to Sydney wasn't wasted and we shot off and we got a new harness and some safety lines just so I'd survive the trip down. So anyway, later that week on Tuesday, the marine wind warning was retracted and John told me to come up to Sydney again.
Alright guys, what is up? Just having a toasty here. Made it to Nowra. Left super early. 2 o'clock in the morning, I was out the door. Should get up to Sydney at around 8 o'clock. And yeah, should be good. Need to let John know that I'm making it a bit early because I couldn't get back to sleep. So here we are. Anyway, I don't feel tired yet, so that's good. It'll probably hit me later on. Alright. I managed to pick up a couple of lures before I made it onto the boat to see if we could pick up a few fish on the way down, which was where my headspace was at. I'm like, well, it's going to be a fun little trip down. I'm going to be fishing. It's going to be great. But I was a little bit wrong. When I got to the boat, I fitted my temporary dodger, which I showed you guys last time. Did my pre-starts, which this is when the cracks started to show. So I decided to check the transmission. And when I did check it, it was right at the bottom of the dipstick, right at the bottom hash line. Not being super familiar with this sort of transmission check, I gave it a bit of a Google. Turns out it was very low, which starts to spark the little cogs in the back of my brain going, how long has John been not topping it up with enough oil and how well has he really maintained this motor? A little bit of Googling and we find out what sort of oil it is and we get it topped up and off we go. We dropped the mooring ball and we headed out of Sydney Harbour with just one reef in because it was so windy still. So we decided to bench for training and the acclimatisation day we'd planned prior, and we just decided to just get it done because we had time constraints. Long story short, if we didn't make it down to Bermagui by Sunday, we wouldn't have a lift back up to Sydney. So because the wind hadn't actually seen any of the weather reports, it was dying out as we headed out towards the heads, and it was now getting later in the afternoon. Because it was dying off, John shook out the reef and
and we got out into the deep blue, as they say. And we headed southeast to get some sea room and find that delicious East Australian current. So because I'm new to this sailing game, I asked John 2 questions derived from books that I've read. Number 1 question, do I need to turn the seacocks off? John's response, nope. So it was apparently not a concern for John. I also asked, should we put a reef in the mainsail before dark? Again, nope. So as it got darker, it became choppy, and we were starting to bounce around quite a bit. John started hooking into some snacks, which included some potato chips. And then I saw him go for some ginger herbal tea tablets. Yeah, if you know, you know. So this was probably around 5 p.m. This was about when the conversation ceased. I'm thinking, wow, John is contemplating life, enjoying his last hurrah in his beloved boat. Conditions continued to deteriorate, and then it began. So John started making a weird belching sound. And then he started spewing over the side of a cockpit. And then it escalated. So now I'm not just hamming this up to be funny or anything. That was what was happening out there. This goes on for a number of minutes, and we even switched side of the cockpit when the wind shifted. So there's nothing I can do, and I just leave John go at it. I just turn my focus to the compass and just let him do what he's doing. So John goes silent for a bit. I'm talking real silent, like he's dead. So I glance over at John. John is now motionless with foam all around his mouth and down his beard, and he's slumped over sideways in the cockpit. And I'm thinking, oh, that's not good. I'm like, John, are you okay, mate? Nothing. Donuts. There's no movement, he's totally unresponsive. I let go of Attila, I grab his legs to put him in a recovery position to maintain the airway, and then all of a sudden I get... It was wild, it was like he was in suspended animation. Then he immediately goes back throwing up over the side of the cockpit like nothing had ever happened. I sit down, reach my arm over to get a nice comfortable brace of the outside of a cockpit, and I feel something slimy all over my hands. With the hand now slick with John's vomit, the gravity of the situation is sinking in. I'm 15 to 20 kilometres offshore, conditions are worsening, it's just turned dark, the last boat I'd seen was a few hours ago, I'm at the helm of a sailboat that I'm totally clueless how to do anything on but hold the tiller, and the guy that knows how to sail is now an incapacitated 82-year-old with a pre-existing heart condition. And I'm getting tired, but I don't dare leave the tiller, even to wash my hands. So the hours tick by, John digs out some real seasickness medications, and he manages to keep it down. He's still pretty cooked though, and he's still making the weird burping sounds every maybe 5 or so minutes at this point. So he's back to being semi-functional, which is good. So, phew, ordeal over, right? Apparently not so. Because the universe didn't think I had enough things going on, it increased the wind speed to the point where we were well overpowered, and it was time to get the sail down. So John mustered up enough strength to head up on deck and battle the sails, and to my horror, he was raw dogging it. He wasn't clipped on, and he was pitching all over the deck like a drunken sailor, as they say. So I watched all this in horror, thinking at any moment this guy could go in, and that'd be the end of it, because I would literally have no way of turning the boat around to the point to get this guy. So after about 5 minutes of failed attempts to get the sail down, I watched Heart in Mouth as somehow God's hand guided him back to the cockpit, where he slumped down. He was pretty much exhausted and defeated at this point, and this wild card here needed to get into the mix. So John had to drive by wire through me, just explaining what to do, because I'd never ever come across winches like. They're just old school looking winches. They've got weird clutches, and I'd never had to deal with anything like that. Somehow I managed to get up there, stow the sail, which was now a tangled mess with all the reefing lines. And when I got back to the cockpit, I checked my phone, expecting it to say something like, I don't know, 4 a.m. But this ordeal has actually managed to stretch time, and it's only about 10 p.m. 11 o'clock comes, then 12 o'clock, and I'm starting to do the old rest one eye at a time. Still no offer for swapsies, so at this point at 1 o'clock, I just said, John, sorry man, I gotta go to sleep. I just crawled into the quarter berth and died for a few hours. I came up, checked on John. He was back pretty much with it, so travel calm had done its job, and despite the setbacks, the sun actually did rise. So we're heading towards Jervis Bay, which is our halfway point. So we agreed to rest and get moving the next morning. Approaching, the wind was strong and it was on the nose, and with the motor cranking, we were only just crawling along. And the motion on board was getting reasonably violent, and we were getting like pitched and thrown around a bunch. And later I was talking to John about it, and John said at one point he got thrown from one side of a cockpit to the other, and he thought he had broken his back. I'm glad he internalised that at the time and didn't tell me. Over the course of a trip, I did see him stack it a few times, and it is pretty scary seeing an older person fall down like that, and you think that he's definitely broken something for sure. But we got him there in one piece. Anyway, so the sea was increasing, and all of a sudden the motor cut out, which we assumed that we would be out of fuel. I went to top up the fuel tank, but it was overflowing after a couple of jerrys, which means that something else was a problem. So I'm thinking maybe something had shaken up in the tank and it had blocked the primary fuel filter, so I went ahead and changed that. When I got that out, all the pleats were looking brand new. There was no dirt or anything in the pleats, so I suspected it to be another part, which I don't even know what it is. But there's a little day tank contraption under the motor, which I think may have been the problem, but because of the conditions, it was just way too hard to get at. It's hard to explain how horrible getting thrown around, covered in diesel, and still not being able to fix the problem with the engine was, but compared to the night before, it wasn't that bad. While I was flapping around with the engine, we got blown further and further back towards our start point. So the decision was made to put the sails up, and by the time we did actually put up the sail, we were quite a ways from Jervis Bay again. So once the sails went up, I went down below because there's not really much I could do. I just decided to contemplate my life decisions, pretty much considering how to sell this boat without my missus getting too angry at me, because I was pretty certain I'd made a pretty big mistake. And I wish I was joking, but I am not. I was really going through the thought processes of how do I sell this boat, because it was absolutely miserable. So I'm laying on the cabin sole and exhausted at this point, but it is the best spot on the boat until I realised there's water sloshing around me. It seems sailing in these spirited conditions, there was some water legs showing up. So when we went into submarine mode and we were heeled over pretty hard, the windows were leaking, and then as we were punching into the waves, the dorades were leaking. As I'm looking around on the floor, thinking, gee, there's a lot of water down here, I realised that the sink was leaking, and after shutting off those sea cocks, I realised that the toilet was overflowing. So I was just laying on the ground in toilet water. So, is John trying to kill me? And it took about 5 or 6 hours to get into the mouth of the bay. So John called me up and showed me the position on the paper chart. He was using an old school handheld GPS and also a paper chart to navigate. I was happy to go along with this because the novelty of it was pretty cool. I was also being a bit naughty and also checking Google Maps on my phone because we were still in service. So John is pointing out to me the narrow pass how we enter the harbour, which I might add, because of the conditions, is also braking quite heavily, and just tells me that's where we're entering. My brain almost explodes because when I looked and saw what we were looking at, because I'm a little bit better rested, I think, and when I looked around, what I saw an enormous open bay and then a small island on the south head, which John was about to try and thread the needle. So after a bit of back and forth and a visit to Google Maps, we opted for the non-death entry into the bay. Still to this day, I try not to think about what would have happened if he didn't call me up on deck and he just decided to sail on through. Anyway, so we're sailing in just on dark, and the conditions had eased off a bunch and it wasn't as bumpy. John was apparently using the force to navigate across the bay to find a spot where we could anchor that wasn't Marine Park. There wasn't any protection in there from the wind direction, so we just ended up dropping the anchor when we got to an appropriate depth of about 13 metres, and he let out 30 metres of chain. Anyway, I'm also thinking that might not be enough scope, but I'm new here. Anyway, pretty uneventful night. I had a slight panic attack because I got stuck inside of my wet weather gear. inside of the quarter berth, which I don't know if anyone out there's had that happen to them before, but it is unpleasant. So good news bears, guys. I didn't awaken to the sound of fibreglass getting eaten by rocks, so all was good. But I did realise that had we have gone any further on the course we were on the night before, we would have run over a big mussel farm that was in Jervis Bay. So that was pretty lucky, I would say. So the next morning, after some sleep, I was able to jury rig up a new fuel tank from a jerry can, and we just started running directly off that, and we proceeded to head out of Jervis Bay. So the weather now was glorious, and there were whales and dolphins. It was pretty much all the things that were in the brochure. All was good. Every few hours we'd have to go through the process of topping up a jerry from the fuel tank, and then we'd pour that jerry into the other jerry, so there was diesel and stuff going everywhere, but the system works. We ended up having no more problems, and it was pretty much cool stuff from then on. So the wildest animal experience also happened to me while I was out there. I've never had an experience like this. So that night I saw something that I will never forget. We're cruising through the phosphorescence, which in itself was amazing. Like it was some full-on Harry Potter stuff. But to see the dolphins playing in the phosphorescence, just like glow-in-the-dark missiles, it was something else. So you could never get that experience anywhere. On our final night, John was very apprehensive to give me the tiller, maybe in case he thought that I would sail us to New Zealand or mess it up, who knows, but he just kept on trucking the whole night, kept on asking him, and he would not relinquish the tiller. Until daybreak. So at daybreak, he finally relinquished the tiller. John went down there and he passed out on the floor, and he was motionless for like 2 hours. There was definitely a sigh of relief when I did see him move after that. After his nap, he was revitalised, and we managed to make it into the harbour. Anyway, we got in, we tied up, showered at the marina, which was of a bargain price of $1 a minute, which was pretty wild. And the missus picked us up, and then we headed straight back to Sydney to drop John off at his car. As an added extra bonus, woke up in the middle of the night at the hotel that we stayed in that night in Sydney, and thought I was still on the boat because of how the room was laid out. So just some musing. So there's a bunch of stuff I learned on this trip. I don't think I'll ever have as bad of a trip as that again, touch wood. Although John scared me a few times, it was awesome to have him along, and I'm grateful he agreed to help deliver the boat down the coast. And he also said that it was hands down the absolute worst sail that he's ever had. So I guess, I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing, but he was going for more than 40 years sailing. Anyway, hopefully things get better from here. Thanks for listening to me bleed about my ordeal, and I'll see you guys next time.